to make comments, to ask questions, to disagree, to throw out Bible passages, verses. We want it to be a discussion, not just us sitting here and talking. Although I don't mind sitting here and getting to talk to you because you're so pretty. But we would love for you to join us in the conversation. We're going to start off tonight talking about something that I think is appropriate for what's going on in our country, and just all different times throughout history, actually. We're going to start talking about being obedient to the government and the biblical view of that. What does God expect of us as far as our obedience to the government? And then we're going to get even past the theory, I hope, and talk about some practical things. What does God expect practically about my obedience, with my obedience to the government? Okay, so we'll start off. If you got your Bibles with you, just go ahead and open them up. The Hunts are watching. It's good to see y'all. Let's just go ahead and open up to Romans chapter 13. Did you bring a Bible?
I'm relying on it. I'm grabbing this one.
Oh, that's the American Standard Version. It's gonna be a little bit different. It's okay. I mean, it's a good Bible. It's just different.
Okay.
Some people like it.
Romans 13.
Romans 13. I have my Bible on my phone. Okay, so Romans 13, why don't you just read for us the first few verses in Romans 13? It's like Romans verse 1 down through like verse 7 or so.
Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not...
Let's pause there for just a second. We'll just take it in chunks. I know I asked you to read the whole thing, but let's just take it in chunks.
Okay.
And so the first thing is, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. What does that mean to you?
Well, if you are a subject under that government or that kingdom or whatever, then you should act as a subject. You should be in subjection. You should be following their command or their decrees, I guess. Yeah,
every person. Right? There's no exceptions. Mm-hmm. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. So there's this idea. It's written in almost a passive way, but he's telling them what to do. Be subject to the governing authorities. But he just says, let them be. Right. So it's almost like he's saying, don't hinder people from being subject to the governing authorities. Is kind of the way it comes across in English, but the idea is just do what the government says, mm-hmm. right? And that would be no matter where you are. Like if you are in England, then you should be subject, even if you're an American citizen. Right? If you're in England, then you should be subject to the governing authorities in England. There's no exceptions here. He doesn't say be subject to the governing authorities only in the country where you happen to be a citizen. The theory of nations really isn't around yet. It's weird to think that the idea of a nation hasn't really developed yet. It's in the works, historically speaking, but there were regional governments, and wherever you happen to be, whatever government was in control, whatever people actually were in power, you were to be subject to those people. And when he says governing authorities, he's not talking about a system. He's talking about people.
The authorities.
The people, the persons with an S. So there would be, when you go to England, there's a person there who is in charge. Simon's here. Hey, Simon, it's good to see you. And you should obey them. So like when the first people you see when you come off the plane is whoever the customs people are, whatever nation you've just traveled to, they are governing authorities, and you need to be subject to them.
Right.
And so when they ask you, did you bring any fruits, vegetables, or plants? You need to tell them the truth, and you need to let them search your luggage if they want to. You can't say, I'm an American citizen, you can't search my luggage. You need to pay the duty on the Toblerone that you're trying to smuggle into the country. That's just how it works. And what we tend to do, what I hear often from people of faith, is that they will try to argue that they have certain rights, so they don't have to listen to the governing authorities. In our country, especially, we have this thing called the Constitution, and people want to say, well, the Constitution guarantees rights, so I don't have to listen to this person who is a governing authority. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the text, and this is a really important thing about the text here in Romans 13, it doesn't say let every person be subject to governing documents. That's not what it says. It says be subject to the governing authorities. Now, were there documents that governed ancient people?
Probably.
In Rome, there were. You better believe in Rome there were. Romans loved their law. You know, they had a codified law system. They had lawyers. They would go to courts and they would argue back and forth. Some of the most famous Latin orators are lawyers.
There's Hammurabi's Code. And
yeah. So law codes have been around for a long time. But he doesn't say be subject to the law codes. He doesn't say be subject to the legal statutes of the. He doesn't say those things. He says be subject to the governing authorities. He's talking about people. And you have to be subject to the people who are in power. And I think that's an important distinction that we sometimes might not see or that we might ignore. I don't think that ignore isn't the right word. Maybe we don't think about it because we like to defend our rights. We like to say, well, I have these rights, and because I have these rights, I don't have to listen to the people who are in charge.
Well, it's less personal, I guess. Because having to listen, I don't know, it's kind of like social media, you know, mm-hmm. You can do it with, you can say things or disobey or, I don't know, maybe it's not a good comparison, but never mind, scratch the social media comment. But I was just thinking, like, if I'm saying I'm subject to a law, I don't have to listen to you. Like,
that's the thing.
The person.
I think that's why he says governing authorities, because then, okay, there's the Constitution, which is a good thing. You know, we have our legal code, but who gets to interpret the legal code?
Because I'm going to use that to argue against what you're telling me to do
right
now.
Right. Now, our country is fairly unique in the history of the world in that you are given the right to protest. You're given the right to voice opposition. And most governing authorities will allow you to do that because they'll get in trouble if they don't, according to our system of rules. So I'm absolutely not saying that you can't protest or doing that. We're not talking about that at all. We're just talking about the general idea of a governing authority. For example, if the governing authorities where you happen to live come on the television and say, please wear a mask in public, what would be the response of a believer? What should be the response? Well, you could argue technically that, well, they don't have the legal right to require masks. You could do that. You could say something like, well, they're only asking, they're not telling. But then is that really the heart of what is being discussed here? Is that really what Paul is saying? Is Paul looking for loopholes so that you don't have to be, you know, a model citizen? And when you look, especially through Romans chapter 12 and Romans chapter 13, the idea in these passages is to do whatever is honorable in the sight of all people. Mm-hmm. You know, you're not supposed to be a rabble rouser. You're not supposed to be somebody who is causing trouble. You don't want to be known as a troublemaker. You want to be somebody who the governing authorities, they have nothing bad to say about you.
Yeah.
And you see that, I think, with Christians who get arrested throughout history, and they should not have anything bad to say about you.
Yeah. When
they arrest you, they should be like, well, the only thing that we can say bad about this person is that they're a Christian. Yeah. And many believers throughout history, people aren't perfect, but many believers throughout history, especially the first century, first, second, third, fourth century, first, second, third century, as people are being arrested and being put on trial for being Christians, the only thing that they have against them is that they're a Christian. And that's how it should be. You know, that's kind of the idea here is believers, disciples of Jesus, should be model citizens. We should be the people who seek to obey.
Right.
Not hanging on to my rights, you know, being difficult because I have the right to be difficult. Right. That's not the idea. That's not what we're seeing captured here. We want to be people who follow the law, or we want to be people who are obedient as long as we can, right? And that's the catch. Simon says, except for when it comes to sharing the gospel.
Sorry.
I'm sure he's never heard that joke before. All the disciples suffer horribly for going against the law of the land or the Jewish leaders. Yes, that is one of the few times where there will be an exception to this. Paul is not saying disobey God so that you can obey the government. He's not saying that. And you see that in Acts chapter 4 and Acts chapter 5. Peter will actually pose the question to the Jewish leaders, whether it is right or not to obey you instead of God, you be the judge. And obviously he expects them to say, no, you should obey God. You can see with Daniel is another, Daniel's three friends, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. When they are told to bow down and worship a false god, they refuse. And they say, no, you can kill us, but we're not worshiping that statue. And maybe God will save us, but maybe he won't. But we're not worshiping that statue. And so the king is infuriated, and he throws them into a furnace, and God does protect them. But what if God didn't? What if they got thrown into the furnace and they were burned up and they died? Does that change what they should have done? No. And so when we read that story, we tend to think, oh, well, if I do the right thing, if I stand up and obey God and I don't obey the government, where there really is, a genuine conflict, like that government, that king, right? It's not a government, it's the king demanding that they worship this false god. They said no. I would fully expect to be thrown into the furnace and die. Maybe God will deliver me, but maybe not. It doesn't matter. My job is to obey God. And so that you see that again with Peter and the disciples. They're brought before the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin says, stop talking about Jesus. And they say, no. And so the Sanhedrin beats them with rods. And they leave rejoicing because they were counted worthy to suffer for the name of Jesus. They didn't get protected. They were punished for breaking the law. And so there are a very few times where we can, where there is a genuine impasse, where I absolutely cannot obey the government. Right. John Blackburn said, I think I can show comments on here. Yeah, I can look at that. John said if they died, they would inspire survivors to be courageous. That's exactly right. If I stand up and say, I'm not going to do this, and the king says, I'll kill you if you don't, and I'll say, fine, kill me. Yeah. And then they do, that's fine. And you see that exact thing that John mentioned. You see that in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. There are many people who are converted because of the way that Christians died. Yeah. And we don't necessarily think of my suffering as being a tool for spreading the gospel, but they absolutely saw that. In fact, one of the early Christians says that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And he's not trying to say that we don't need to listen to the scriptures. He's not trying to say any of those things. What he meant when he said that was that people encountered the gospel, right? They encountered Jesus. They encountered Christ through the suffering of these Christians. And so it's really important that where there is a genuine impasse, where I have to choose, that we're not afraid to choose Jesus. Right? We're gonna follow God no matter what. And God tells us to obey the rulers. So if we're going to be people who follow God no matter what, then we should be trying to obey the government
no matter what.
No matter what, right? Unless there is one of those hard impasses where we cannot.
Yeah. Which in our country, so far, we still have freedom of religion, so it shouldn't really be a problem.
Yeah, John says that, he'll put that up there too. I really like that we can do this now. I noticed that the times that government and God conflict in matters of ideology, or that they conflict in matters of ideology and not necessarily justice. Yeah, I would agree with that, because people, I think, generally know the right thing to do. And what you're doing when you stand up for Christ is you're standing up for something that is otherworldly, right? For something that isn't like the way the rest of the world operates. People generally are not willing to die for ideas, right? Most people, there's a reason why throughout history governments have tortured soldiers, prisoners and things like that, because if I torture you, you're going to tell me what I want. Yeah. That's just generally how it works. But Christians would suffer. Christians would make a choice that to the Romans was just foolish, where all you have to do is say, basically, hail Caesar. That's all you have to do, is just to admit that Caesar is a god. You really don't have to worship him. Or sometimes they would say, if you'll just offer a pinch of incense, you don't have to go and make a big sacrifice. You don't have to go to a festival. Just here's a little pinch of incense. Just toss it at the statue and you're good to go. They would refuse to do it. And it confounded the Romans. They're like, look, we're not even asking you to believe this. We're just asking you to do it. And it's almost like the Romans at times were pleading with these Christians, please don't make us kill you. And the Christians were like, no, you're going to have to, because I can't do that. And one of the things that we see when that is what's going on, where it's worshiping a false god or worshiping the true God, that's an easy scenario. You say, no, I can't do that. That same fortitude that would say, I cannot worship that false god, must be present when it comes to obeying the commandments that the true God has given us. And one of the commandments from the true God is to be obedient to the governing authorities. And so if we are going to be those kinds of people, then that should be our attitude. A long time ago, there was a question that came up in a Bible class. And I remember this because my answer was the wrong one. And there were a couple people there who were older and wiser, and they said some things that really changed the way that I thought about this passage. The question came up, we were in a Bible class, and the question came up, what if the government passed a law that said you could not pray in a restaurant? Right? Tomorrow, the government passes a law, maybe because they're afraid that it will spread the coronavirus if you talk too much in a restaurant. And so yeah. So they say, no praying in restaurants. What would you do?
Me?
Yeah, that was the question. That was the question. What would you do? And in my mind, I didn't voice it. Somebody else voiced this, but in my mind, I was like, I would pray anyway.
Yeah.
I'm going to go, and they can't tell me not to pray. Who are they? They can't be in charge of me. And immediately in my mind, I thought of Daniel.
Right.
Who goes and he prays. And there's that law that says you can't pray to anybody but the king, I think for 30 days. Mm-hmm. And Daniel prays anyway, and he gets in trouble. And I thought, yeah, I'll be like Daniel. I'm going to pray anyway. But the thing about Daniel is, go ahead.
In secret.
Yeah, he did it in secret.
Yeah.
Right.
He would go out there.
Yes. He didn't go in the middle of the street and go, hey, everybody, I'm about to pray. Watch this. He didn't do that. He went like he was already doing. He didn't start disobeying because now he had an opportunity to disobey. He had already been praying multiple times a day. So he just kept doing what he was already doing, and he did it in secret. Right. The people who caught him, they had to lay a trap to catch him.
Yeah. And
so Daniel's not an appropriate example for that, because my idea, my thought was, well, I'll go and I'll pray anyway. I'm going to show them. Then an older man said, older than me, right? Somebody who was older and wiser said, I just wouldn't go to restaurants. Or I would just pray before. We'd pray in the parking lot, to tell God, thank you for the food we're about to have. Or eat at the restaurant and then go pray afterward in the parking lot. There is nothing in the Bible that says you must pray within 30 seconds before consuming food, right? It's just not there. And so there was this false dilemma where in your mind, you're like, well, they can't tell me not to do that. Actually, they can. They can make a rule. A restaurant could tell you, there's no praying in our restaurant. You're not allowed to do that. And now you could decide never to go back to that restaurant, but you could also just pray before you go in or pray after you leave, and you're not violating the law. And so there's this idea where all of a sudden I realized that if I am going to be a disciple of Jesus, and if I have that desire to stand up for Christ in the face of even death, then I should also have this same desire to be obedient to what he calls me to do, even when it's not a life or death situation. And what he calls us to do is to be obedient to the governing authorities. And so my desire should be to obey, to find a way to obey. People will say things like, oh, I would find any way that I could to worship God. Like, let's say tomorrow it became illegal to worship God at all. What would you do?
I would just do it in secret.
Yeah, we would find a way, which is what Christians have done throughout history, right? They would meet in catacombs. They would meet out in the wilderness, right? They would go find a way to do it because their desire was such that they were going to find a way around the difficulty so that they could still serve God. Well, here God is telling us, just like being together with other believers, offering worship, offering prayer to God is something God asks us to do. He's worthy of it. He deserves it. He asks us to do it. We should do it. He also asks us to obey the ruling authorities. The same desire that drove Christians to catacombs and drove them out into the wilderness should be present to obey the government. And not the government necessarily the institution, but the people, to obey the people who make up the government. And that changed the way that I thought about this. And kind of coming back again to the Constitution, well, I have these rights. Who gets to interpret the documents? Who gets to interpret the laws?
The people ruling.
The people ruling, right? And that might change depending on where you are, what culture you're in. When it comes to the Constitution, ultimately, the people who get to interpret that in our country is the Supreme Court, right? They are the interpreters of the Constitution. So I would have to allow that ability, right? I don't get to interpret the Constitution for myself. The governing authorities get to interpret the Constitution. And so I have to listen to the governing authorities based on how they interpret those documents. And so there's really not a way around the people, even with our system. And that's difficult because we kind of want to do what we want to do. And we'll use things like the Constitution or whatever, the Magna Carta, I don't know, wherever you happen to be. That's like 800 years ago. We'll use whatever we can to get our way. And the same thing sometimes happens with the Bible. I'm not allowed to interpret the Bible in a vacuum. Like, I don't get to take the Bible, and you can see that principle in Peter's letters where he says no prophecy of Scripture is of private interpretation. I don't get to take everything that God has said and just make up what it means. Right? That's really a separate topic, but it's kind of the same thing. Is I'm not the one who decides what the government does. It's the ruling authorities. And so it's really important that we read that. And when we look at just that first sentence, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, not to the documents, but to the people. And that's in my mind, that really changed how I view what Paul is saying there. Any other thoughts?
I hadn't thought about that before. So I think that's a good thought right there. Just submitting to those in power.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This as a slightly different idea of the government institution.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Simon asked a good question. Let's put that up there. Does that pertain to working on the Sabbath? Back then, how Jesus confronted the Pharisees. They were one of the groups of Jewish leaders, and yet Jesus confronted them. Are we allowed to question our leaders? So I guess maybe we can start backwards and work up through that question. I don't know if there's a way to make the whole question show up. I guess not. Are we allowed to question our leaders? In our country, yes, you are. And there actually was even a process in Hebrew culture. They debated their laws, right? They argued about what they mean, and if you had an argument, there was a way to do all that. That's where we get things like the Talmud. They're compilations of rabbinic opinions about what the law means. And so there wasn't like a monolithic understanding of the law of Moses in the first century, which is why you'll have the question, the religious leaders would come to Jesus and say, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? That was a question that was being discussed about their law, and there are basically two camps. One said yes, and the other said no. And so there's a debate amongst those leaders. And so in all cultures, there's always debate about the finer points of law. And Jesus is kind of a special example because he's the lawgiver. And so that's like the Supreme Court is walking around. Jesus is kind of the Supreme Court walking around. And so we have to be careful when using Jesus as an example, because he gets to do things that I don't, just because of who he is.
Oh.
Yeah, he's God. He knows things that I don't. But I get the question. I get where Simon is coming from, because you see Jesus doing things that they thought were wrong, in particular with the healings on the Sabbath. And the thing about that is that Jesus didn't do that without explanation. So you have the lawgiver present, and he's explaining to these people, hey, this is what the law really means. And one of my favorites is where Jesus heals somebody and they want to get angry. And he's like, look, if you had a donkey and it fell into a ditch, if you had an ox and it fell into a ditch, would you get it out on the Sabbath? If your son fell into a well, would you get him out on the Sabbath? Or would you say, sorry, kid, see you tomorrow, right? So he explained things, and he desperately wanted those people to understand God's wisdom. And so even with Christ, the thing that I think we can see there is this desire for people to know God and to live according to God's will for them. Mm-hmm. And so that maybe is what we can learn from those situations with Jesus, is that in my life, I want to live, behave, act, speak in such a way that people see God's character and God's wisdom. And if I'm constantly shoving my rights in people's face, refusing to do things because I have my right, you can work against what Jesus was trying to do, which is to show people God's love, his mercy, to show people God's righteousness, God's justice, these great things that set God apart from the rest of creation. Jesus wanted people to know those things. And even in those instances where he's butting heads with the Pharisees, you see this love and mercy of trying to explain. Please listen. And he did a good job explaining the law.
I think it's important to remember that we're really not citizens of this country, or we shouldn't be primarily. We should be citizens of God's kingdom. And so if we get a little run over in this country with our rights, that's okay. Because this isn't the world that we're living for. We're living for God's kingdom. So, okay, they run over our rights a little bit. We didn't like that. They went a little too far. And, when it comes to what we're allowed to do, to say something against that, if we want to peacefully protest, or if we want to vote someone else in, things that you can do that are submissive and are not against what we're allowed to do. And you can do it peacefully. Mm-hmm. Fine. But if that doesn't change things, well, that's okay. We're not staying here forever. It's okay.
But to come back to the mask example,
yeah.
If your governor or mayor or whoever asks you to wear a mask, then you should. And if you don't like it, next election, vote for somebody else.
Yeah.
That's how our country works. Not everybody has that kind of government. And that's one of the things really that's amazing about Romans 13 is Paul is writing to the Christians in Rome, and the Roman government is not really friendly to Christianity. At first, they don't really care about Christians because they kind of see them as Hebrews. It's a Hebrew thing. And while the Romans think that the Christians are a sect of Judaism, they're actually afforded legal protection, because the Jews were given special circumstances in ancient Rome. They did not have to worship the Roman gods. The Romans learned that you just don't do that with the Jewish people. They're not going to worship your gods. So the Christians for a while kind of had special protection because the Romans thought they were Jewish. After a while, it becomes pretty clear that they're not, and then they lose their protection. Right? I can't remember if Christianity specifically is ever declared to be an illicit religion, which would make it completely illegal. I think the difficulty that they had with Christians is they wouldn't worship the Roman gods, which is a crime against the state, which is why they would kill you, because it carried a capital punishment if you wouldn't worship the Roman gods, because you were going to detrimentally harm the Roman state. Well, Paul is writing to Christians who have a king, Caesar, whose will and word is law, and sometimes that will and word are not friendly to you, and he's telling them, obey them. Peter will write to people living under the Caesar and tell them to honor the king and all the kings, right, who might be over you in the weird way sometimes that the Roman society structured things. But there's the government in the first century that most Christians lived under was not friendly to them, and there was no recourse. You didn't get to vote Caesar out next year if you didn't like his decisions, right? You just had to obey him. And your job was not to change the Caesar's mind. I mean, if you had the opportunity, take it, right? But your job was not to argue politics. Your job was to obey. Again, unless there's one of those hard rubs where there's no way around this. But I don't think that happened too terribly often, actually. And so to come back to the mask thing, well, I guess we talked about that. Yeah. If I don't like how somebody is leading in our country, I can vote for somebody else next time. But while they are the leader, I should be submissive to them. And that's just not popular. That's in our country. Generally speaking, that submission to a ruler is not something that you see. We are not respectful as a culture of the rulers in our country, and we don't like to do what they tell us because I can do whatever I want. And that's really not a biblical attitude. Any other thoughts about that?
We can keep reading.
Yeah, that was like verse 1.
Those are 2 verses.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid. For it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them. Tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor.
All right. Well, then he's going to go on in verse 8 and say, owe no one anything except to love each other, for love has fulfilled the law. So that's kind of our idea, is to be these people who are known as those who listen and who love.
Yeah, so we can lovingly and lawfully live.
So Simon says, Jesus often directed us to examine our heart instead of focusing on the action itself. Yeah, I agree. It was a heart issue. If we focus on what we like and dislike instead of what God wants us to do, we're often interested in ourselves and our feelings instead of focusing on what God wants. And I think that's exactly right. There are things going on with governments that we don't know, right? God throughout history is raising up and tearing down rulers, nations, what we would call nations, all of those things. And so it's interesting to see that we are called to obey because the governments are actually serving God. We don't necessarily know when or how or why, but it says the governments are serving God. They're being brought up and torn down. John says this is the passage that destroys libertarian ideology. It kind of does, because the libertarian ideology is that I get to govern myself, and that's not what this is teaching. And so we have to be careful that we don't allow our politics to get in the way of what God says.
Yeah. We just have to trust.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, goes with what Simon was saying. We just have to trust that God is in control. And whether we like what's happening or not, or whether we think it's fair or not, God is in control and he will work all things for good.
Yeah. And I think their comments, John's and Simon's comments, go together.
Mm-hmm.
Why would I be a libertarian? It's very appealing, actually. Why would I be a libertarian? Because I feel like I'm the boss of me. I know it's best for me. I'm going to do what I want to do, and nobody can tell me otherwise. What have I just made myself?
The boss.
Yeah. Yeah. I've made myself like Caesar, a god, a king, at least, right? And I think that really is at the heart of this dilemma, is I want to be my own God. That's what Adam and Eve do in the garden. They want to be God, so they eat the fruit. And all throughout history, people want to be God. That's why every time somebody becomes a king, what do they suddenly become? They become divine. And so it really is difficult.
Well, we want to be in charge, but God says to be in submission. So
yeah, it's not easy. If it was easy, he wouldn't have to write these things to these people. Right. It's hard. And it's especially hard when we feel like the government is wrong. It's very, very difficult to submit to somebody that you think is wrong. You know, like if you were a kid and your parents maybe thought you did something and they didn't, that sense of grave injustice that you feel. Mm-hmm. Like I remember one time.
Uh-oh.
What? No, I'm not talking. No. I've learned not to do that. One time we had a babysitter who was over at our house, and there was gum, and she said that we could have a piece of gum. So I went and I got a piece of gum, and everything was great. And we were walking around, and then I came out of the kitchen, and she said, "Let me smell your breath." It's like, well, that's weird. Okay. And so she smelled my breath, and she said, "You got another piece of gum, didn't you?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Yes, you did. Your gum still shouldn't smell good."
What?
So she made me spit my gum out. And I just remember I know.
You just spit your gum out?
I still have nightmares about it. But you know, that sense of grave injustice. I was a little kid, right?
I still remember this.
Yes.
That's impressive.
Yes.
You really were hurt.
Traumatic. This idea that I've been wronged. That's why I remember it. Because I was wronged. But the person in power was telling me to do something. They were wrong, and they were telling me to do this. Yeah. And when that happens with our government, when I feel like the government's wrong, this whoever this is, the mayor, the governor, the president, the senator, the congressperson, when I feel like they're wrong, I don't want to listen to them. Yeah. There is that.
I shouldn't have to do this.
I shouldn't have to. They're wrong.
I should have just spit my gum out.
Yeah. And he doesn't say submit to the governing authorities when they are correct. He says submit to them. And that's hard.
Well, you were a good boy.
She was bigger than me. I didn't have much choice.
She was going to tell your parents too.
That's true. That's true. God gives grace. God resists the proud, Simon said, but gives grace to the humble. That's exactly right.
Wait, the part I was just thinking, I said she would tell your parents, the government, in a way, tells God, because God sees you not obeying. So you just have to remember that when you obey the government, you're obeying God.
Yeah, and that's the point, is God is the one who says to do this.
God's the boss. Yeah. Ultimately.
Mm-hmm. And it really is a matter of being willing to listen to what God says.
I think we just have to be reminded of that. I am obeying God. I am obeying God.
Yep. I'm really not obeying this person who may or may not be right.
Yeah.
You know, they could be totally wrong with whatever policy it is, with whatever law they could be totally wrong. But I'm going to follow them, not because I think they're right, but because God says.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that really does help when you think about it like that. I am obeying God, not that ruler. Mm-hmm. And I imagine that that's how the Christians were able to obey Caesar. I'm not obeying Caesar. I'm obeying God.
Yeah.
And so whatever Caesar says, I guess that's what we'll do. Again, as long as it's not one of those hard impasses, we'll just.
Right.
Yeah. All right. I think, what time is it? How are we doing? Mm-hmm. It's been about 50 minutes or so. Did you have anything else you want to talk about? Okay. Yeah, we won't get into tax laws or things like that, but you should pay your taxes. Yeah, that's another thing that's really unpopular. You know, when you think about it, when you're filling out all those IRS forms, you're not obeying the IRS. Because I know people who have raised constitutional arguments against income tax. I'm not the one who gets to decide what the Constitution says. The government tells me, the governing authorities tell me to pay income tax, so I do.
Well, I think about Jesus. Jesus said, under Caesar, what's Caesar's?
Yep. It's not my money. It's their money. I just use it.
If Jesus paid taxes, then I guess we should too.
Yep. And that actually removes some of the temptation to cheat. It's not the IRS taking money away from me. I'm obeying God, and God says to pay these taxes, so I will. Yeah. See, Kenny says, I don't think Romans 13 is talking about only obeying men and not actual written laws, though. I think it's both. And when those conflict, I don't know, is there more to that, Kenny? Oh, I can't see the rest of it. Yeah, the people to whom he's writing have a legal code. I think we brought that up already. They had written laws, but it becomes a question of interpretation. And so he's not saying, I don't think he's saying that you have no legal rights whatsoever, because you see Paul exercise his rights as a Roman citizen.
Right. He killed Caesar.
Yeah. But he allowed himself to be beaten. In Philippi, he's thrown into jail and he's beaten and he's in the prison, and it's not until the rulers come. So I mean, it's difficult to do sometimes, but there is this line that we walk, and we're going to make mistakes all over the place, but we try to be people who love and who obey. Simon said, what is one way as a church do you think that there should be a guideline between listening and not listening to the government? That's hard to come up with a guideline other than always try to obey. And so any time that the government called upon me to do something that was directly antithetical to my life as a disciple of Jesus, then I would have to say I can't do that. But
we should try to find a way.
We should try to find a way to obey.
If we can.
And so I think that would be my general rule, is that your tendency is toward obedience. And if there is some kind of question, you try to obey.
And like when they told Paul, you can't preach anymore in the street. Well, okay, Paul won't preach in the street anymore. He'll go house to house or, whatever. Yeah. He'll find some other way. But they didn't say that. They said, you can't preach anymore, period. And he's like, well,
I can't do that.
Sorry, I'm going to have to obey God. I actually do have to preach. So I guess if they had just limited him, then he probably could have worked around that. He would have tried to been lawfully obedient to what they were telling him. But they said he couldn't preach, and God said he had to. So there's the impasse part.
Yeah. Kenny, I don't know if maybe we addressed what you were saying, or if there was more to your comment. If there was, I'm definitely interested in hearing your thoughts. Kenny actually works in law enforcement, so yeah. Feel free, if there's something that I missed, feel free to leave that in a comment, because you have a voice that I think we should listen to. But other than that, we'll go ahead and we'll finish for tonight, and we'll be back next week. As always, if you've got questions, please send them in, and we'll try and discuss those next week. God bless you guys. Thank you for being here and for being part of our study. It's better when you're here. It's better when you're here, too.
Oh, thanks.